Hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining me. I'm Ryan. And today we've got Why the U.S. Prison System is the Worst in the Developed World by Second Thought. All right. Let's see why. I know we have a lot of prisoners per capita. I know that.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon.
Aha.
If you'd like to help me produce more content like this and get early access to every new video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. You'll often hear the claim that the United States is the freest place on Earth, a bastion of personal and societal freedom. For such a supposedly free nation, we sure have a lot of people behind bars.
That is kind of ironic.
While many rights and freedoms have been stripped away over the past few decades, from freedom of the press to freedom of assembly, in this video we're going to focus specifically on the US prison system. A system that, by just about every metric...
That's the funny thing about freedoms like that, like speech, press, assembly, protest, is that they're always under attack. That's the truth. You constantly have to fight for
We're
them.
going to focus specifically on the US prison system. A system that, by just about every metric, is the worst in the developed world. Let's start with some basic facts. The US has the most incarcerated people of any nation on Earth, both by sheer numbers and per capita.
I didn't know it was by sheer numbers as well. We are a large country, but considering India and China, the populations of those countries, that's pretty that's scary. Although with China, you honestly don't know the real numbers, but we won't get into that.
As of June 2020, there were 2,121,000 prisoners currently serving
It's 1%. That's a little bit less than 1% of everybody.
time in the US, and a total of over 10 million in the prison system, which
That's a lot more than 1%.
includes those waiting for trial and those on parole. This number is higher than nations with vastly larger populations, like China and India. It's higher than countries the US considers more authoritarian, like Russia or, again, China. It's even higher than the greatest of all boogeymen, the Soviet.
Well, I think we can at least agree. He said considers more authoritarian. Russia is more authoritarian. It still sucks that we have more prisoners. So.
Like Russia or, again, China. It's even higher than the greatest of all boogeymen, the Soviet Union, at the height of Stalin's power. As for our per capita rating, the US incarcerates roughly 655 people per 100,000. No other OECD nation comes close. The UK sits at 140, Canada 107, France 105, Germany 77, China barely cracks 150. All the countries the US likes to cast as authoritarian hellholes, every single one of them incarcerates fewer people and often in far more humane facilities. The US represents 4% of the total world population, but 22% of the world's prison population.
It's wild. Most of it is just drugs. Just drugs. We need to end the freaking insane war on drugs that's been going on for, obviously. It's crazy.
When you talk about prison and prisoners, all the racists tend to come out of the woodwork and say things like, well, those other places are all one race, and immigrants are just inherently criminal. Of course,
Wait, what?
When you talk about prison and prisoners, all the racists tend to come out of the woodwork and say things like, well, those other places are all one race, and immigrants are just inherently criminal.
Whoa. I've never heard someone say something. I have, but never so blatant like that. Those people are idiots.
Of course, these statements have no basis in reality. Among roughly equally diverse nations and countries with similarly sized immigrant populations, our incarceration rate is still vastly higher in every case. We also need to remind these people that white people go to jail too. They're just let off the hook far more frequently than any other race. But we'll get to that later. Now that you have an idea of just how much of an obsession we have with locking people up.
What's actually crazy is if you live here in the States, that for as many people as we have locked up, the crazy thing is we tend to let out some of the worst offenders, just on these insane early releases because there's not enough room in the jails, or when they accept the much lesser sentence for a guilty plea.
Let's talk.
It's insane. Murderers get let out after just a couple of years.
Talk about some specifics. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I identify one common thread that ties together all of the worst tendencies of the American empire: profit. Everything is driven by the insatiable urge to accumulate greater and greater sums of money.
That's
the
true.
stock market demands perpetual growth. Corporations must make more this year than they did last year. The prison industrial complex is no different. We tend to think of prisons as self-contained entities, cruel but untainted by the tendrils of capitalism. This is not the case. Companies have always been eager to work with prisons to increase their profits. The companies that provide food to prisoners are only too happy to sell nutritionally deficient slop to the prison industrial complex. It's cheap to produce and nets them a healthy...
That's harsh, but that's probably so true. I can't imagine calling it slop.
...to sell nutritionally deficient slop to the prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
It's cheap to produce and nets them a healthy profit. The phone companies that provide basic call functionality to prisoners charge exorbitant pay-per-minute rates because they know how desperate these poor people are to speak to their loved ones. Transportation
That's wild.
companies make a killing shuttling prisoners to and from court appearances and between prisons. But more egregious than these examples is the practice of modern-day slavery. You've probably heard that the state of California routinely puts inmates to work fighting fires. Do you know
What? I didn't know that.
What
Fighting fires?
paid for putting their lives on the line? $2 per day, or $2 per hour when they're actively fighting fires. The minimum wage in the US is $7.25 per hour, which is already absurdly low and has been determined not to be a livable wage. Prisoners are paid $2 per hour at best for their labor, less than 1/3 of the federal minimum wage. But wait, it gets worse. Incarcerated people have their own minimum wage. Care to guess what it is? It's not $2, it's 12 cents per hour. Some states, including my home...
I mean, I'm thinking to myself, obviously, I try to be just really think it all, from a lot of different sides and be reasonable. And it does make sense to have a lower minimum wage to me for incarcerated people just because they're already being provided room and board, even though, like he already went over, it's crap. So it's not exactly much, but 12 cents is obviously absurd. And the current federal minimum wage, $7.25, is already way too low. It hasn't been keeping pace. It hasn't been inflation has gone crazy, and the minimum wage has stayed the same for like a decade. So that's just obviously outrageous. It should be like doubled. But then once that was doubled, I would think it was reasonable to say, okay, the prison system, prisoner minimum wage could be like $9 an hour or something. That's just what I'm thinking.
Home state of Texas do not require
But 12 cents?
incarcerated workers to be paid at all. Would you sell an hour of your life for 12 cents? Of course you wouldn't. But the people trapped in the prison system have no choice in the matter. They are required to do the work that is demanded of them. This is
Well, you don't have to work if you're in prison.
slavery. In the past year,
You just won't be able to buy like some of the most basic necessities to have a reasonable life, like toilet paper.
inmates have been put to work manufacturing hand sanitizer and PPE, washing hospital laundry, and digging mass
Wow, look at that. It's so disturbing, huh?
graves for COVID victims. In normal years, they provide forced labor for thousands of US corporations, including big names like McDonald's, Wendy's, Tyson, Verizon, Sprint, Fidelity, Walmart, JCPenney, and IBM. Angry yet? It still gets worse.
Well, that's obviously any kind of work they're doing for a private company, that's outrageous. That's outrageous.
With each passing year, America finds new ways to extract profits from human life. Let's talk about private prisons. As the war on drugs ramped up in the 1980s, federal prisons began to become overcrowded. The solution? Turn to the private sector to build new prisons for all this excess human inventory. The government contracts a private company to build the prisons, that company locks up the overflow prisoners, and in exchange they receive a fixed rate for each inmate. They are paid for each person they imprison. See the problem here? The prison's
It's just that's obviously outrageous.
slave labor market is a financial incentive not to pursue prison reform.
can't believe
it would
that's a
damage the
thing.
profits of thousands of US companies. But by adding for-profit prisons into the mix, cutting out the middleman, and simply making money off of human storage units, we've ensured that no meaningful reform will ever pass, at least not without a mass movement to demand it. Think about it. Who profits from the existence of private prisons? Private companies are given multi-hundred-million-dollar contracts, then their executives turn around and donate huge sums of that same money to politicians who will support private prisons. It's a never-ending cycle. Corrupt
It's so obviously transparently corrupt.
politicians are making money, private prisons are making money, and thousands of US companies are making money from literal slave labor. It makes perfect sense within the US capitalist framework. CoreCivic, formerly Corrections Corporation of America, is the largest private prison manager in the country. In 2019, they raked in $1.98 billion in revenue, all on the backs of exploited human beings, stuffed into their prisons with a price tag on each one. What's even more ridiculous is that the vast majority of the private prison contracts contain a lockup quota. That is, a guaranteed percentage of occupancy for the duration of the agreement. Most of these quotas are set at 90% occupancy, with some even landing an insane 100%. So, in a time...
It just makes the incentives so out of whack. A total conflict of interest between them and the prisoners, you know, and the people of the constituents, you know, who they're locking up.
Time when crime rates
They're getting paid. They want to lock more people up. That's insane.
Are the lowest they've been in decades, these private prisons are guaranteed to have their cells filled. If those cells aren't filled, they're still paid as if they were. And guess who pays the bill? US taxpayers. There was one hideous incident in 2008 which became known as the Kids for Cash scandal. 2 judges in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania were found to have been accepting bribes from for-profit correctional facilities to dole out ridiculously harsh sentences for minors. Thousands of children were slapped with extended stays in these private facilities for crimes as minor as making fun of their assistant principal on MySpace. There are few things more depraved.
Oh my God, that just makes me that makes me want to throw up. Making fun of your assistant principal. You should be able to make fun of anybody, any public figure you want to. The president of the United States, anybody, let alone your principal.
As minor as making fun of their assistant principal on MySpace. There are few things more depraved than putting innocent children in jail to line your own pocket. So, to recap, the US started the war on drugs which US groups like the CIA were shuttling into the country, began locking people up at unprecedented rates for nonviolent drug offenses, realized we had literally run out of all of our prison space, and decided to contract out private companies in order to lock up more people, and then paid those companies to incarcerate even more people. This system is absurd by any reasonable estimation, and we still haven't even discussed whether or not it's effective. To make a long story short, no, it's not effective. In the United States, we focus more on punishment than rehabilitation, and US prisons are certainly punishment. In fact, they're so inhumane that the United Nations has condemned them as abusive and torturous. And human rights organizations have long asserted that one of the prison industrial complex's favorite tools and
Look at how pathetic this photo is here. Like seeing this man having to crouch down and talk through a slit in the door.
Human rights organizations have long asserted that one of the prison industrial complex's favorite tools, solitary confinement, is literal torture. Once someone has been released from prison, it's much harder to find a job. And 2 out of 3 end up right back in a cell because their situation is so desperate. We've even seen people commit tiny crimes and purposefully get arrested because then at least they'd have a roof over their heads. When many Americans hear this, they'll shake their heads and say, you just can't fix some people, completely ignoring the fact that our prison system is not intended to fix anything. Again, this fits in perfectly with the average American mindset. Most people subjected to prison terms are poor. In America, we've been conditioned to believe that poor people are lazy, and therefore morally deficient and deserving of punishment. This, of course, ignores the fact that wealthy people are just as likely or even more likely to use drugs. But those people are rarely sentenced, often because they have important parents, or they can pay bail, or simply because...
Yeah, it's crazy what some, like, important parents can get you as far as, like, if you're a druggie. You won't be going to jail, most likely.
Their communities aren't heavily...
Or if you're famous.
Policed like lower income areas. We've effectively criminalized poverty. Can't pay a parking ticket? Jail. Can't pay bail? Prison term. No one will hire you when you get out? Serves you right for being a criminal. This mindset is truly horrific. It lacks even the barest shred of basic human decency. We cannot ignore the fact that systemic racism plays a large role in the American prison system. 2 men, 1 white and 1 black, charged for the same crime with the same criminal background, are often given different length prison sentences. Can you guess who gets the longer sentence? On average, black people are given 20% longer sentences for the same crime committed by a white person. Then you have white-collar crime. Banks...
It's so weird how I mean, every case is very individual, you know, so it's hard on one hand to say that, but I was going to say it should just be a fixed amount of time for the crime. It shouldn't be up to anybody to say, oh, in this case, I'm going to give you 40 years, and then to this other person, 12.
Have engaged in money laundering for drug cartels and other shady operations for years, bankrolling the very industry we throw people away for, and they caused the single largest economic crash since the Great Depression. Did any bankers get locked up for any significant time? Of course not. There are two separate justice systems in this country, one for the rich and one for everyone else.
That's for sure.
Okay, but what's the alternative? It's not fair to complain and then not propose a better way. Luckily for me, I don't have to come up with an entirely new system. Plenty of vastly more humane, more modern, and more effective prison systems already exist. One shining example is Norway. With an incarceration rate of just 60 per 100,000, Norway stands out as a prime example after which we could model our own prison system. Norway's criminal justice system focuses not on punishment like we do in the US, but on rehabilitation and the principle of restorative justice. The Norwegian criminal justice system caps prison sentences at 21 years and does not allow the death penalty. Whereas prisons in the US look more or less like slightly updated medieval dungeons, Norwegian...
Most Americans wouldn't be happy with this. They wouldn't want that to fly, especially like the older generations. We're lucky we even have innocent until proven guilty, because in the public eye, that's not even the case.
Prisons are quite...
Here in America, they're just like, all right, well, send them to the chair,
different.
If you've been accused of a crime.
This footage is from Halden Prison, which was completed in 2010 and is representative of Norway's incarceration philosophy. Everything is intended to foster an environment of improvement for their inmates.
Wow.
The rooms are reasonably comfortable and furnished with quality of life features like DVD players and TVs.
Now here, it would make more sense for people to be committing crimes to go to jail, honestly. And there's only 60 per 100,000, so apparently people don't do that, which is just... It's probably because there's a better social safety net overall, too, so they don't need to do that to go, to be able to live.
The inmates can roam more or less freely, wear normal clothes, and make use of common areas and kitchens. There's a store where they can buy their own food. The architecture is specifically designed to allow those inside to see out into nature and observe the passage of time. US prisons, by contrast, are made as oppressive as possible. Little light from the outside world, cramped corridors, tiny, uncomfortable cells, and a relationship with the guards which can only be called antagonistic. That's another area where Norwegian prisons excel. Their correctional officers all complete a 2-year degree before they're able to work as what are called contact officers, which function as both guard and social worker. Halden Prison prides itself on fostering excellent interpersonal relationships between inmates and contact officers. They can interact freely, talk, play cards, make plans for the future, and just generally have a normal human experience in the prison. This is all part
It seems like a utopia, like amazing.
of the philosophy of normality. The idea is to make prison as close to life in the outside world as possible, so that when inmates have served their time, they're able to more easily adjust back to normal life. Again, this is in stark contrast to the US system. The goal of our system is to punish, to make people suffer so that they're afraid to commit another crime. Corrections officers in the US have very little required training, and relationships between guards and prisoners are truly awful. It's not uncommon for guards to brutalize or sexually assault the inmates. This cruelty is completely counterproductive. If the goal of our prisons was truly to rehabilitate, why have the guards, the only representatives from the outside world, treat the inmates like animals? Norway's recidivism rates are among the lowest in the world, with just 20% of inmates getting arrested again within 2 years. This isn't random. It came about by a concerted effort from Norwegian citizens to overhaul their criminal justice system. Back in the 80s and 90s, they were concerned about rising recidivism rates. So they did the logical thing and fixed the problem: the prisons. Modern Norwegian prisons are some of the very best in the world in terms of reducing recidivism and promoting a positive trajectory for inmates. They provide counseling, education, and as normal an experience as possible. What they've accomplished in the last few decades is truly remarkable, and should be seen as one of the world's best criminal justice systems. Another prime example is Finland. Finland is one of the happiest and safest countries in the world. They have access to universal healthcare, subsidized childcare, and free college education. They also have incredibly humane prisons. This man, serving a life sentence for murder, is not confined to a tiny cell for the rest of his life. He's not waiting for a lethal injection or months of solitary confinement. He's free to come and go as he pleases, and there aren't any cell blocks at all. Instead, the prison is laid out like a dormitory. He can attend classes at the local university, and his room at Loka prison is almost indistinguishable from a normal apartment. Like Norway, Finland believes in the principle of...
Very interesting. Honestly, as an American myself, it's you can't help but look at that and think, well, what would the family of his victim, whoever he murdered, think about this? It's certainly interesting because in reality, what's best for society is to rehabilitate. So this is probably, the best method, but it is. A lot of people would not like that here in America.
Normality. That prisoners should be treated like human beings and provided all the opportunities to improve themselves and get on a more productive path during their prison stay. Inmates receive counseling, job training, and interact with prison staff in a normal, human fashion. Because of these innovations and a dedication to actual rehabilitation, Finland's incarceration rate has dropped dramatically over the last 70 years.
That's really impressive.
To just 1/4 of what it was in 1950, and it's now one of the lowest in Europe. By comparison, the US prison population has skyrocketed in that same period, despite our own crime rate dropping. Just to give you a sense of how barbaric and
how does that even make any sense? It's insane.
Outdated our prison system seems to other developed nations, Finland now operates a prison museum in one of their old 19th century prisons, as a sort of reminder of how terrible their system used to be. It is almost indistinguishable from a modern US prison. It's clear that the US has a long way to go before it can be considered a truly free nation. Our horrific prison industrial complex is a permanent stain on this country's legacy. The systemic racism,
it's so horrible,
use of slave labor, inhumane treatment, and outright torture of prisoners, and the commodification of human lives to be locked up in order to increase profits is truly wrong in every way. If we're actually angered by this and really want to make a change, we have positive examples to point to and say, this is what we want. It won't happen by itself. The only way things will change is the only way things have ever changed. By enough people coming together to say, enough is enough. We're trying something new. I mentioned at the beginning of the
Easier said than done here in America, where the media and the people are constantly distracted by a bunch of crap that doesn't, it's basically just constantly dividing everybody and getting nothing done. That was super interesting. I enjoyed that video a lot. Thank you, Second Thought. Have a great day, guys, and I hope to see you here again tomorrow. Usually I'm reacting to stuff from like the UK on this channel. Sometimes I do stuff like this where it's just, reflecting on America versus the rest of the world. Anyway, have a great day and goodbye.